It was a bitterly cold winter night, one of those that would leave your breath hanging in the air like vapor, turning into ice before it could even float away. I was alone, huddled in my house just outside of the small town of Winter Haven. The snowstorm had trapped me in for the night, as it often did during these harsh winters. There was something eerie about the way the wind howled through the cracks in the walls and the way the storm seemed to press against the house like it was trying to break in. The house had been passed down through generations. My family had lived there for as long as anyone could remember, but there was a lingering sense of unease in the air. The house was old, creaky, and full of strange little noises. It had been years since anyone had really talked about it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something just wasn't right about it. It wasn't until that winter night that I learned just how wrong it all was. I was sitting by the fire, listening to the wind rage outside, trying to distract myself from the growing sense of unease that had settled over me. My thoughts wandered, and I began to wonder what it would be like if the house had more history to it, if there were secrets buried beneath its floorboards. The thought made me uneasy, but I quickly pushed it aside. That was when I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible knock on the door. At first, I thought it was just the wind rattling the shutters, but then it came again, louder this time, more deliberate. It wasn't the wind. My heart began to race as I stood up and moved cautiously toward the door. I peered out through the frosted glass, but there was no one there. The snow was falling heavily and the porch was empty, just as it had been for hours. I stood there for a moment, my breath fogging up the glass as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. I turned away from the door, shaking my head as I tried to rationalize it. It must have been the wind. It had to have been. There was no other explanation. But then the knocking came again. And this time, it was louder. And closer. I froze, my blood running cold as I realized something wasn't right. I slowly backed away from the door. My eyes locked on the handle as if expecting it to turn at any moment. The storm outside raged, the wind howling like a beast, but all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart in my ears. The knocking stopped, but I could still feel something in the air, a presence like a weight pressing down on me. My mind raced as I wondered what I was dealing with. Was it someone playing a cruel joke? Or was something far worse lurking outside, waiting to be let in? I took a deep breath and turned to look around the room. The fire crackled softly in the fireplace, casting flickering shadows on the walls. The house creaked, settling into the night, and I could have sworn I heard faint whispers coming from the hallway. I told myself it was just my imagination that the storm had gotten to me. But then the temperature dropped, and I could feel it. An unnatural chill in the air that seemed to seep through the walls. The fire in the hearth seemed to dim, its warmth sucked out of the room by an unseen force. I stood there, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of what was happening. I had heard stories about the house, whispers from the locals about strange occurrences and inexplicable events, but I never thought much of them. Until now. I walked toward the hallway, my feet barely making a sound on the old wooden floor. As I moved deeper into the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The darkness seemed to stretch on forever, and the shadows felt like they were moving, shifting just beyond the edges of my vision. That's when I heard it. A voice, soft and distant, calling my name. At first, I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me, but then it came again, louder this time, clearer. It was a voice I didn't recognize, but there was something familiar about it. It felt like someone I knew, someone from my past. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned and started to move toward the source of the voice. It was coming from the basement. I don't know why I went down there. Something inside me told me not to, but my feet seemed to move on their own. I reached the basement door, its old wooden frame creaking as I opened it. The air inside was colder than the rest of the house, and the darkness seemed to stretch out in front of me like an abyss. The voice called again. This time closer. It sounded desperate, almost pleading. I stepped down the creaky wooden stairs, the silence pressing down on me as the storm raged outside. Each step felt like an eternity, and I couldn't help but feel like I was being drawn into something I didn't understand. At the bottom of the stairs, I turned on the light, the dim bulb flickering as it sputtered to life. The basement was as old and musty as I remembered, filled with boxes of forgotten memories and old furniture covered in dust. But there was something different about it now. Something off. I looked around, my breath fogging in the air, and then I saw it. A figure, standing in the corner of the room, just barely visible in the shadows. It was tall and thin, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare directly into my soul. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its presence like a weight pressing down on me. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the sound of the storm outside. The figure didn't answer, it just stood there, watching me. I felt a sudden wave of dread wash over me. Something told me that this was no ordinary person, no wandering stranger who had somehow made it into my house. This was something else, something old, something that had been waiting for this moment. My feet felt like they were stuck to the floor, my body frozen with fear. I tried to back away, but my legs wouldn't move. The figure took a step toward me, its movements slow and deliberate. I couldn't look away. My heart was pounding in my chest, my skin crawling as the figure drew closer. It felt like I was trapped in some kind of nightmare, and there was no escape. The figure reached out, its cold, skeletal hand brushing against my cheek. I recoiled, but the touch was like ice, freezing me in place. Then I heard it. Loud and clear this time. A voice, rasping and cold. "You shouldn't have come here." The words sent a chill through my entire body, and I felt a scream rise in my throat, but no sound came out. I was trapped in the basement with something that wasn't human. Something that had been waiting for me. Something that had been lurking in the shadows for years, perhaps even longer. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed with fear. The figure continued to move closer, its hollow eyes never leaving mine. I could feel the cold seeping into my bones, and I knew, deep down, that if I didn't escape soon, I wouldn't make it out alive. Finally, I managed to break free from the figure's hold, stumbling backward up the stairs. I didn't stop running until I was back in the warmth of the living room, my heart still racing, my breath shallow. The fire in the hearth was flickering weakly, as though it too was afraid. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I sat there by the fire, listening to the wind howl outside, but I could still feel the presence of the figure, lingering just beyond the walls. The storm raged on for hours, and when morning finally came, I left the house. I couldn't stay there any longer, not after what I had seen, what I had felt. I packed a bag and drove to the nearest town, determined to never return. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, waiting for me. That figure, that voice. It's always in the back of my mind, especially during those cold winter nights when the wind howls through the trees and the shadows seem to stretch just a little too far. I don't know who or what it was that I saw that night, but I do know one thing. There are things in this world that we are better off never knowing.
Next story.
It was the kind of winter night that made you question if you'd made the right choices in life. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, and the cold seemed to seep into every corner of the house, no matter how high you cranked the heat. I was alone. Alone except for the darkness and the silence that had settled over the old house. You see, I never wanted to come here, but I had no choice. The place was my grandmother's. She'd passed away earlier that year, and with no one else to look after the property, it fell to me. There were rumors, whispers in the town that the house was cursed. I had heard them growing up, of course, but always dismissed them as small-town superstitions. But now, as I stood there, the shadows growing long on the walls, I wasn't so sure anymore. The storm had picked up, and the snow was falling so thick outside that I could barely see the old oak tree in the yard. I tried to focus on the fire crackling in the hearth, but my mind kept drifting. My grandmother had never spoken about the house's past, but the rumors had been clear enough. Strange things had happened here. Strange, terrifying things. People said they saw shadows moving when no one was there, heard voices when the house was empty. It all seemed like nonsense to me, until that night. I was getting ready for bed, just trying to push everything out of my mind. The house creaked and groaned, as it always did in the cold, but there was something different this time. Something off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I felt it in my bones. I decided to lock the doors. I'd always thought it was a little excessive, but tonight it felt necessary. I made my way to the back of the house where the old kitchen door had always stuck. It was the door my grandmother had warned me never to open, though she never told me why. I figured it was just one of those old family secrets, something you didn't question. But now, standing before it, I felt an uneasy pull in my chest. I could feel the cold air creeping through the cracks in the door, like it was breathing, alive. I stepped back from it, feeling suddenly small in the face of something I couldn't understand. The house had always felt old and tired, but tonight, it felt as if it was awake, like it was waiting for something. I went back to the living room, trying to shake off the creeping dread, but that's when I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible noise, like a whisper. I stopped dead in my tracks, straining to hear it again. The wind howled outside, so it was hard to distinguish, but it sounded like a faint, distant voice, too soft to be real, too clear to be ignored. I tried to dismiss it as the wind playing tricks, but it came again. This time, I could swear I heard a name. My name. I stood frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. It wasn't possible. The house was empty, and I was alone. Weren't I? I turned toward the stairs, the dread in my stomach growing with every passing second. A sudden chill washed over me, and I could see my breath fogging in the air. I told myself it was just the cold, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. There was something else in the house. Something watching me. I made my way up the stairs, each step creaking beneath my feet, echoing through the empty halls. My grandmother's room was at the end of the hallway, but I didn't want to go there. Not tonight. Something was pulling me toward the attic, something dark and dangerous. The stairs to the attic were narrow and steep, and I could barely see where I was going. But I couldn't stop myself. My hand reached out for the pull string, the familiar roughness of the rope in my palm. I pulled it, and the wooden door to the attic creaked open, revealing the darkness beyond. The attic was like something out of a nightmare. Old furniture, covered in white sheets, loomed in the shadows. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of mildew hung in the air. But it wasn't the dust that bothered me. It was the cold. The temperature in the attic was unbearable, colder than the rest of the house by far. My teeth started chattering, but it wasn't just the cold. It was something else. A presence, like something was standing right behind me. I turned around, but the attic was empty. Nothing was there. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. As I stepped further into the attic, I noticed something out of place, a small wooden chest tucked away in the corner, hidden behind a pile of old blankets. It wasn't something I remembered from my childhood. My grandmother had never kept anything like that. A voice, soft and low, seemed to echo through my mind. "Open it." I froze. The voice wasn't my own. It was clear now that I wasn't alone in the attic. "Who's there?" I asked, my voice trembling, but there was no answer. Only the rustling of the wind outside. With shaking hands, I approached the chest. It looked ancient, worn with age. The hinges creaked when I touched them, and the lid seemed heavy, like it hadn't been opened in years. I shouldn't have opened it, but I did. Inside the chest were old photographs, faded and yellowed with time. I picked one up, my fingers brushing against the fragile paper. The photo was of my grandmother, young and smiling, standing beside a man I didn't recognize. His face was blurred, his features indistinct, but there was something about his eyes, dark, hollow, and staring directly at the camera. I felt an icy chill crawl up my spine. The air around me seemed to grow heavier, and the wind outside grew more violent. The shadows in the corners of the attic seemed to shift, moving as if they were alive, and then, as if from nowhere, I heard the voice again, clearer this time, right behind me. "Get out." I spun around, but no one was there. My heart hammered in my chest as I backed away from the chest, clutching the photograph in my hand. That's when I saw it, the faint outline of a figure, standing in the corner of the attic. It was tall, impossibly tall, with the same hollow eyes as the man in the photograph. Its face was obscured, but its presence was suffocating. The figure started to move toward me, its steps silent on the wooden floor. "Get out," the voice repeated, growing louder, more insistent. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the stairs as I bolted down them. The house seemed to shake around me, the walls creaking and groaning as if the very foundation was being torn apart. I stumbled into the living room, gasping for breath, my heart racing in my chest. The cold air was biting now, and the fire in the hearth had burned out. But that wasn't what scared me. What scared me was the silence that had fallen over the house, the kind of silence that felt like it was waiting for something. I rushed to the back door, but before I could even reach the handle, I heard the voice one last time, soft and distant, but unmistakable. You should have never come back. And then, nothing. I don't remember much after that. I must have passed out, overwhelmed by the terror, but when I woke up, the house was silent. The storm had passed, and the sun was beginning to rise, but I knew one thing for sure: I would never step foot in that house again. The curse was real. The figure, the voice, it was all real. I don't know what happened to my grandmother or the man in the photograph, but I know they're still here, watching, waiting. And if you ever find yourself near that old house in the dead of winter, I warn you, don't go inside. It's too late for me.
Next story.
It was one of those winter nights where the cold seeps into your bones and the world outside seems to stop moving altogether. The snowstorm was in full force, with thick, heavy flakes swirling around the air, making it impossible to see beyond a few feet. I had been driving for hours, caught in the middle of nowhere, trying to make my way to a cabin I had rented for the weekend. I hadn't realized how remote this place was when I made the reservation. The road was barely passable, and my car's headlights barely cut through the thick blanket of snow. Just as I was about to give up and turn around, I saw it. A small sign for the cabin, barely visible under a mound of snow. I didn't have much of a choice at this point. I needed shelter, and the cabin was the only place around. The driveway was long and narrow, barely wide enough for the car. I parked and grabbed my things, the wind biting at my face as I hurried to the front door. The cabin stood in silence, its dark outline barely distinguishable from the storm. I took a deep breath and pushed open the door. The warmth from the cabin greeted me immediately, and I sighed in relief. The place was quaint, but the kind of charm you'd expect from an old mountain cabin. The fire was already crackling in the hearth, and the place smelled like cedar wood and something faintly like damp earth. I hung up my coat and settled in, unpacking my bags. The storm outside was relentless, and the isolation of the cabin started to sink in. The place had a strange energy, though. The longer I stayed, the more it began to feel off. The windows were covered in frost, and the wind howled outside, making the walls creak and groan as if they were alive. At first, I thought it was the house settling, but then I started hearing noises. Small things at first: scratching at the walls, a faint tapping from somewhere in the house. I dismissed it as just the wind, but the noises continued, growing in intensity as the night went on. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was just tired, but then came the knocking. It wasn't from outside, it was coming from within the walls. Knock, knock, knock. I froze. It was coming from the wall beside the fireplace. The noise was sharp and insistent, like something was trying to get through. My heart raced as I stared at the wall. The wind outside howled louder, but the knocking grew clearer, more deliberate. I had to investigate. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way toward the source of the sound. As I stepped closer, the knocking stopped abruptly. The silence was deafening. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I had imagined it, but then I heard it again. Knock, knock, knock. It was unmistakable. I leaned in, shining my flashlight on the wall. The sound was coming from behind it, deep within the wood. I swallowed hard, my stomach turning with unease. With trembling hands, I searched for something, anything that could explain what was going on. I ran my fingers along the wall, feeling for a hidden door, a loose board, anything. That's when I found it, an old, rusty latch, barely visible. Without thinking, I yanked it open. Behind the wall, there was a narrow, dark passage. It was long and stretched deep into the cabin and hidden beneath the floorboards. I could feel the cold air seeping through, and the smell that hit me was overpowering, musty, decayed, like something long forgotten. Without a second thought, I stepped into the passage. The air was thick with dust, and the walls seemed to close in on me as I moved forward, the flashlight's beam flickering against the stone walls. The deeper I went, the more oppressive the air became, and the sounds of the storm outside faded into the background. I came to a small, dimly lit room at the end of the passage. The floor was covered in old, decaying furniture, the remnants of what looked like someone's long-abandoned home. But there was something else in the room, something that caught my eye immediately. A large, ornate mirror hung on the far wall. It was framed in dark carved wood, its glass clouded with age. As I approached it, I felt a strange pull, as if the mirror were drawing me in. I reached out and touched the surface. The coldness of the glass sent a shiver through my body, but the moment my fingers made contact, the reflection in the mirror shifted. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but then I saw it more clearly. There was something behind me in the reflection, something dark, its features barely visible in the mist that seemed to swirl around it. My breath caught in my throat as I turned around, but the room was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, the figure was closer. It wasn't human, at least not anymore. It was a thing of shadows, with long, outstretched limbs and eyes that glowed a faint, eerie blue. Its mouth opened in a grotesque smile, and I could feel its gaze piercing into me, even though I knew it wasn't real. But it felt so real. Too real. I backed away from the mirror, my heart pounding in my chest, but the figure didn't move. It stayed there, watching me with its hollow, blue eyes. I turned and fled from the room, scrambling back down the passage. The door slammed shut behind me with a deafening crash, as if something inside had been waiting for me to open it. I ran back up the stairs, my breath ragged, my mind racing. I didn't know what I had seen in that mirror, but I knew it wasn't something I should have discovered. I ran back into the living room where the fire was now dying down to embers and slammed the door shut behind me. I was alone. Or so I thought. It wasn't until I heard the knock again that I realized something was horribly wrong. Knock, knock, knock. I turned toward the wall, but this time the knocking was coming from the mirror. The same mirror, the one I had just run from. And then the voice came. Let me out. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The voice was deep, guttural, and it seemed to echo from within the very walls of the cabin. I turned slowly, and there, in the reflection of the mirror, was the figure again, its grotesque smile wider than before, its limbs stretching unnaturally as if it were trying to crawl out of the glass. I ran. I didn't think. I didn't stop to look back. The snowstorm was still raging outside, but all I could hear was the pounding of my heart in my ears, the wind howling in the distance, and the voice, always the voice. Let me out. I barely made it back to my car, my hands frozen to the wheel as I sped away from the cabin, never once looking in the rearview mirror. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back to the nearest town. I never went back to that cabin, and I never will. The mirror, the thing in the passage, it wasn't a part of the cabin. It had always been there, waiting. And I know now that it wasn't just waiting for someone to find it. It was waiting for someone to open it.
Next story.
It was late December when I moved into the small, rural cabin. I had been looking for a quiet, isolated place to finish my writing. The hustle of the city was wearing me thin, and the idea of spending the winter in a place far away from everything seemed like the perfect escape. The cabin, tucked deep in the woods, was exactly what I needed. Rustic, charming, and just remote enough to guarantee peace and solitude. The owner of the cabin, an old man named George, had given me the keys and warned me about the area. Just stay inside when the snow gets heavy, he had said in a raspy voice, and don't go near the old well behind the house. No reason to. It seemed like a strange thing to warn someone about, but I nodded and smiled politely, brushing it off as one of those odd local superstitions. The first few days were perfect. I spent most of my time in front of the fire, writing and sipping coffee, occasionally taking walks through the snow-covered woods. The cabin was warm, and despite its isolation, it had a peaceful charm. The nights were quiet, too quiet sometimes, but it wasn't anything I couldn't handle. The silence was deep, the kind of silence that felt like it was pressing in on you, making you feel small and insignificant. Still, I didn't mind. The stillness was exactly what I had wanted, but as the days wore on, something started to feel off. At night, I began hearing sounds, faint, distant noises that seemed to come from the woods. I'd be sitting in front of the fire, lost in my thoughts, and then I'd hear the rustling of branches or the soft crunch of snow. It wasn't an animal, I was sure of that. It sounded too deliberate, too human. I tried to ignore it at first, but each night it grew louder, until it was impossible to dismiss. The first time I ventured out to investigate, I stood in the snow for a long while, listening. There was nothing. Only the cold, biting wind that stung my face and the vast emptiness of the forest. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching me. waiting. Then, one evening, it happened. I was sitting at the kitchen table, writing by the soft light of the oil lamp. Outside, the storm had picked up again. The wind howled and snow began to fall in thick sheets. It was the kind of storm where the world outside the window disappears, swallowed by the white. I had just set my pen down, ready to take a break, when I heard it. A soft, slow knock at the door. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't expecting anyone. George had left me alone, and there wasn't anyone else for miles. The knock came again, slower this time, as if someone was testing the door, unsure whether it would open. I stood up, hesitant. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. The knock came a third time, more insistent. I moved cautiously toward the door, my hand trembling slightly as I reached for the handle. My mind raced. Who could it be? Was it someone lost in the storm? The thought of a stranded traveler gave me a small sense of comfort, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I opened the door, and there was nothing. Just the swirling snow and the darkness of the forest. I stepped outside, calling out into the storm, but my voice was swallowed up almost immediately by the wind. There was no sign of anyone, just the snow falling in thick, heavy sheets. I closed the door behind me and locked it, uneasy now, my thoughts swirling. Maybe it was the wind playing tricks on me. Maybe my mind was starting to crack under the solitude. But something about it felt too deliberate, too real. That night, I couldn't sleep. The storm raged on, and the noises outside returned. Rustling, scraping, and that unmistakable sound of something moving through the snow. It was closer this time. Much closer. My heart raced in my chest as I pulled the blanket tighter around me, wishing the warmth would chase away the creeping dread that had settled in my bones. Around midnight, I heard something that froze me in place. A faint whisper, almost like a voice, calling my name. I sat up in bed, my eyes wide in the darkness, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The whisper came again, this time louder. Help me. I stood up, my mind racing. There was no mistaking it. Someone was out there. I grabbed a flashlight, my hand shaking as I fumbled to turn it on. I crept toward the door, the cold air seeping through the cracks, and slowly opened it. The storm had eased slightly, but the night was still thick with snow. I stepped out into the darkness, calling into the wind. Hello? Who's out there? For a moment, there was nothing, just the silence of the snow falling, the sound of my own breath in the cold. Then I heard it again, a faint rustling from behind the cabin. I turned toward the sound, the beam of the flashlight cutting through the snow. The beam flickered, catching something, just a flash of movement in the distance near the old well. I didn't want to go there. The memory of George's warning came rushing back. But the whispering continued, and the voice was getting closer. I had no choice. My legs moved before my mind could catch up. I walked toward the well, the snow crunching beneath my feet. The wind whipped around me, the storm picking up once more. As I reached the well, I stopped. The air around it was colder. The snow was thick here, almost unnaturally so, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. The faint glow of the flashlight illuminated the stone structure, and I could feel my heart hammering in my chest. I looked down into the well. For a moment, everything was still. Then a hand reached up. It wasn't a human hand. It was thin, skeletal, the skin pale and stretched tight over bone. It gripped the edge of the well, and the whispering started again, louder this time. Please, help me. I staggered backward, falling into the snow as I scrambled away from the well. The hand was still there, reaching out, its fingers curled in a desperate grasp. The whispering grew more frantic, echoing in my head, and then, with a final screech, the hand disappeared into the depths of the well. I couldn't breathe. My legs trembled as I forced myself to stand, unable to tear my eyes away from the well. The wind howled around me, but all I could hear was that whisper, fading into the night. I ran back to the cabin, slamming the door behind me, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I locked all the windows, all the doors, and sat in front of the fire, not knowing what was real and what was not. The storm raged outside, but inside, it was quiet. The next morning, the snow had stopped. The world outside was covered in a thick, untouched blanket of white. The well was still there, sitting at the edge of the woods, silent as ever. But I knew what I had seen. I couldn't shake the image of that hand, the desperate grip. And I knew then that the cabin, the woods, and the well were not just isolated. They were haunted by something dark, something that would never let go. I never went near the well again.
Next story.
It was a cold winter night, the kind where the wind howls like it has a mind of its own, and the frost clings to everything, making even the air seem like it's solid. I had been driving for hours through the winding roads, trying to make my way home after visiting some old friends who had moved to the country. The snowstorm had picked up when I was halfway there, and by the time I reached the turnoff to the old family cabin, I knew I was too far out to turn back. There was no one around, no phone signal, nothing but the muffled sound of the wind scraping against the trees. I pulled my car into the gravel driveway of the cabin and turned off the engine. Everything was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. I stepped out of the car, and as soon as my boots hit the snow, a sense of dread washed over me. I shook it off as just nerves, but I had this uncomfortable feeling that I was being watched. The cabin had been in our family for generations, a remote place we'd go to get away from the world. It had a certain charm, but tonight it felt different. Maybe it was the storm, or maybe it was just the isolation that made everything feel so wrong. I grabbed my bags and walked inside, the creaky door groaning as I pushed it open. The smell of old wood and dust hit me immediately. The fireplace was cold, so I set to work lighting a fire. As the flames started to flicker, I poured myself a glass of whiskey and settled into the couch. That's when I heard it. A thud. It was faint at first, but it grew louder as if something heavy was being dropped upstairs. I froze, listening. My heart started racing. I couldn't tell if the sound had come from the wind or if there was someone else in the house. I stood up, my legs shaking, and grabbed a flashlight. The upstairs was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the fire below. I called out, "Hello? Is someone up there?" There was no answer, just the wind rattling the windows. I crept up the stairs, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched out before me. The door to the bedroom was cracked open, and the shadow of something moved inside. I felt my breath catch in my throat. My first instinct was to run, to get out of there and never look back. But something kept me rooted to the spot. I called out again, but my voice seemed small against the oppressive silence. I pushed the door open. The bedroom was empty. The bed was made, and nothing seemed out of place, except for the window. The curtains were drawn back, and there was a dark figure standing outside in the snow, facing the house. I blinked and rubbed my eyes, but when I looked again, the figure was gone. I backed away from the window, my pulse hammering in my chest. I couldn't explain what I had seen. Maybe I was just imagining things, my mind playing tricks on me in the cold and isolation. But as I turned to leave, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. My heart skipped a beat. I spun around, but no one was there. The footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, like someone was walking right behind me, but there was nothing to see. I started moving faster, my steps turning into a frantic rush as I headed back to the stairs. When I reached the bottom, I nearly stumbled, my hands shaking as I grabbed the railing to steady myself. I couldn't stay in that house. It felt like it was closing in on me, suffocating me with its cold, empty presence. But just as I was about to reach for the door, I heard it again. The thud. This time closer, coming from the kitchen. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't alone. I grabbed the nearest weapon I could find, a rusty old poker by the fireplace, and made my way into the kitchen. The cold metal felt heavy in my hands, but it was better than nothing. The kitchen was dark. The only light came from the faint glow of the dying fire in the next room. I reached for the light switch, but before I could flip it, something moved in the corner of the room. A shape. A shadow. I froze again, my breath caught in my throat. Suddenly the light flickered on, and there, standing in front of me, was a woman. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and hollow, and her mouth was twisted into a faint, unsettling smile. I stumbled backward, my legs trembling, my heart racing. "Who are you?" I gasped, my voice barely a whisper. She didn't answer. Instead, she just stared at me, her head tilting to the side as though she was trying to figure me out. I was too afraid to move, too afraid to breathe. And then she stepped forward. I felt the air in the room grow colder, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. She reached out with a skeletal hand, and before I could react, her cold fingers brushed against my skin. I cried out, but no sound came from my throat. Everything in the room seemed to warp and twist. The walls felt like they were closing in on me, and I could hear the whispers again, the same whispers that had been echoing in my head since I arrived. "Leave," they said. "Leave before it's too late." I didn't know what it meant, but I didn't wait to find out. I pushed past the woman and ran out of the kitchen, back toward the front door. My hands were slick with sweat as I fumbled with the lock, desperate to escape. The door swung open, and I ran into the snow, not caring about the freezing cold biting at my skin. I didn't look back. The wind howled around me, and the snow seemed to blur everything, making it impossible to see more than a few feet in front of me. My car was still parked in the driveway, and I ran toward it, hoping I wasn't too late. But as I got closer, I saw something in the reflection of the car's windows. A figure. The woman. She was standing just behind me, her face twisted into that same eerie grin. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. My heart pounded in my chest, and I thought for sure I was going to die right there. But then, as if the wind had swallowed her whole, she was gone. I didn't wait for anything else to happen. I jumped into the car, slammed the door shut, and sped off down the driveway, the tires spinning on the ice. I drove for miles, not knowing where I was going, only knowing that I had to get away. I couldn't explain what had happened. I couldn't make sense of it, but I knew one thing for certain. That house, that cabin, wasn't just abandoned. It was haunted.
Next story.
The night had settled into an unnatural quiet, the kind that wraps itself around you and makes you question the very stillness of the air. I had been traveling for hours, winding through the icy mountain roads, hoping to make it to my uncle's cabin before the storm hit. I had been warned about the weather, but I wasn't prepared for the feeling of isolation that came with the retreat into the wilderness. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, snow was already starting to drift across the driveway. The wind was picking up, and the first flakes of the storm were swirling in the air. I parked the car and grabbed my things, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling in the pit of my stomach. The cabin was older than I remembered, and it had been years since I had been here. My uncle had passed last winter, and I was left with the cabin, his last request for me to take care of it. I pushed open the heavy wooden door, the hinges creaking in protest, and stepped inside. The warmth from the fireplace greeted me, but it didn't bring any comfort. The house seemed to have an eerie quiet, as if it was waiting for something. The familiar smell of pine and old wood filled my lungs, but beneath it, there was something else, a faint, musky odor I couldn't quite place. I shrugged it off, thinking the house had just fallen into disrepair. I unpacked my bags and made myself a drink, the only companion on that lonely night. The storm outside was growing stronger, the howling wind now a constant companion, but I didn't feel alone. There was something else in the house. It was a presence, one that was just out of sight, but always there. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, but the hair on the back of my neck stood up every time I passed a dark corner, every time the temperature seemed to drop even lower. I decided to go to bed early, thinking that sleep might help clear my head. The wind continued to howl outside, but it was silent, too silent. I tried to focus on the warmth of the blanket, the rhythmic ticking of the old clock on the wall, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in that room. It wasn't until I heard the first noise that I began to truly panic, a soft, scratching sound at the window. At first I thought it was the wind, the trees scraping against the glass, but then it grew louder, persistent, desperate. I pulled the blanket tighter around me, hoping that whatever it was would just go away. But it didn't. The scratching stopped suddenly, and I waited. My breath was shallow, my heart hammering in my chest. And then I heard a whisper. It was faint, like a breath on the wind, but it was there in the room with me. "Help me." The voice was weak, hoarse, as though it had been trapped in the walls for years. I froze, staring into the darkness. The whisper came again, closer this time, as if it were right beside my bed. "Help me, please." I jumped out of bed and ran to the window, pulling the curtains back to see nothing but a sheet of white outside. No one was there. The cabin was empty. I bolted from the room and ran downstairs, my heart racing as my mind tried to process what I had just heard. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way toward the basement, where I knew my uncle had stored his tools and old furniture. I had never liked the basement. It always felt wrong, like something wasn't quite right down there. But I needed to know. The stairs creaked under my weight as I descended, the air growing colder with each step. When I reached the bottom, I shined the flashlight around the small, dimly lit room. The walls were lined with shelves, cluttered with old boxes and forgotten memories. The floor was covered in dust, and a heavy smell of mildew filled the air. I was about to turn back when I saw it. A small door, barely noticeable, hidden in the corner of the basement. I had never seen it before, but something in my gut told me that it had always been there, waiting. The door was slightly ajar, and as I pushed it open, a draft of cold air rushed out, sending a chill down my spine. Beyond the door, there was a small crawl space. I hesitated for a moment, but the whispering came again, louder this time, as if coming from the very walls. Please. I stepped inside the crawl space, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The air was thick with dust and a sense of dread. There in the far corner was something that shouldn't have been there. A small wooden chest covered in cobwebs. I walked over to it, my breath coming in short gasps. The whispers grew louder as I approached, and I could feel the weight of something pressing against me. The chest was old, its wood warped and weathered, but it was locked. I knelt down and searched the floor for a key or any sign of how to open it. That's when I noticed it. The strange symbols etched into the wood. They weren't anything I recognized, but they looked ancient. Almost as if they had been carved into the chest by someone who had known something they shouldn't. With trembling hands, I picked up the small key that was hidden beside the chest, buried in the dust. I inserted it into the lock, and as I turned it, a cold gust of wind swept through the crawl space. The lid creaked open slowly. Inside, there was nothing but a small, tattered piece of paper. My fingers shook as I reached in and pulled it out. The paper was old, the edges frayed, but the writing on it was unmistakable. Help me. They won't let me go. The handwriting was faint, almost illegible, but the words were clear. I felt a cold chill run down my spine as I looked around, the whispers growing louder, more urgent. I could hear them now, all around me, like they were coming from the walls themselves. I dropped the paper, and as I did, the room seemed to spin. The crawl space seemed to close in on me, the walls pushing against my chest, making it hard to breathe. I turned and ran back toward the stairs, but something grabbed my ankle, pulling me back. I screamed, my heart racing, and I kicked frantically, trying to break free. The grip was like ice, cold and unyielding, pulling me down into the darkness. But just as I thought I was done for, the grip released, and I stumbled forward, gasping for air. I ran up the stairs and out of the basement, not stopping until I was outside, gasping for breath in the freezing air. The wind howled around me, and the snowstorm had turned into a blizzard. I ran toward the car, but when I looked back at the cabin, I saw something in the window. A face. It was my uncle's face, and he was smiling.
Next story.
It was the dead of winter when it started. The wind howled against the house like a living thing, scraping the walls and rattling the windows. I had come to the old farmhouse to escape the chaos of the city. The promise of quiet, isolation, and a chance to write was exactly what I needed. But as the snowstorm outside grew more intense, I began to realize that the quiet wasn't what I had hoped for. The house was ancient, built sometime in the late 1800s, or so I was told. It had been in the family for generations, passed down from one relative to the next, until it eventually ended up in my hands. The place was sturdy but creaked with age, each floorboard groaning under my weight as I moved through the rooms. It was beautiful, in its own way, full of dark wood, worn rugs, and the kind of charm that only old homes could have. But there was something about it that made my skin crawl, even in the daylight. Maybe it was the cold drafts that swept through, no matter how tightly the windows were sealed. Maybe it was the way the house seemed to be watching me, its shadowy corners always seeming to move just out of the corner of my eye. But the worst part of all was the silence. The kind of silence that felt heavy, pressing in on me. I had heard the stories about the house. They said it was haunted, that it was cursed. I didn't believe it, of course. Not at first. Old houses always had their strange noises, creaking floors and doors that didn't close properly. Ghost stories were just that, stories. But as the storm raged on outside, I began to feel like maybe there was something to those old tales. It was on the third night that it happened. I had settled in by the fire, a mug of hot tea in my hands, the room dimly lit by the dancing flames. Outside, the wind screamed like a banshee, and the snow piled up higher and higher, blocking the windows and making it impossible to see the world beyond. I had just begun to drift off when I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible tapping. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the tapping grew louder, more deliberate, as if someone was knocking at the door. I froze, staring at the front door, waiting for it to open, for someone to walk in. But the house remained still, as silent as ever. I tried to shake it off, but the noise persisted. And then it came again, only this time it wasn't from the door, it was coming from the staircase. Light tapping, followed by a heavier step. It was the unmistakable sound of someone walking, someone coming closer. I stood up, heart racing, every instinct screaming at me to run, to leave the house. But where would I go? The storm was so fierce, the snowdrifts piled up so high I couldn't get out even if I wanted to. The thought of leaving was more terrifying than whatever might be upstairs. I gathered all the courage I had and made my way to the staircase. My hand gripped the banister, the wood cold against my palm. The steps creaked beneath my weight as I slowly ascended, my breath catching in my throat. With each step, the sound of footsteps grew louder, closer. When I reached the top of the stairs, I froze. The hallway stretched out before me, dark and narrow, the old wallpaper peeling in places. At the far end, the door to the guest room was slightly ajar, the dim light from the hallway casting strange shadows across the floor. I don't know why I went to the door. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the overwhelming need to prove to myself that I wasn't losing my mind. I stepped toward it, and as I did, the door swung open with a soft creak. Inside, the room was empty. But that's when I saw it. In the corner of the room, there was a figure standing by the window. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the wind outside. But as I stepped closer, I saw it clearly, a tall, gaunt figure draped in a tattered, old-fashioned coat. The figure was facing the window, its back to me, but the air around it seemed to crackle with an unnatural chill. "Hello?" My voice trembled as I spoke, the sound small and fragile in the vast emptiness of the house. The figure didn't move. It was as if it didn't hear me, or if it simply didn't care. I stepped closer, reaching for the doorframe to steady myself. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The closer I got, the colder the air became, as if I were walking into the very heart of winter itself. That's when the figure turned. Its face was hollow, sunken in, like the skin had been pulled taut over bone. The eyes, if you could call them eyes, were dark voids, empty and endless. The thing stared at me for what felt like an eternity, and in that moment, I was paralyzed. It opened its mouth, and the sound that came from it was like the wind itself, low, mournful, a howling, guttural wail that made my ears ring. The air around me grew thick, suffocating, and I could feel the temperature plummeting. I wanted to scream, to run, but my feet felt like they were rooted to the floor. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place, unable to move or breathe. When I finally snapped out of it, I ran. I ran down the stairs, through the living room, and straight out the door. The wind and snow hit me like a wall, but I didn't care. I ran through the storm, not stopping until I reached the edge of the property, where I collapsed in the snow, gasping for breath. I didn't go back to that house. I don't care if people say I was just imagining things. I don't care if they think I was caught up in the loneliness and isolation. The thing I saw that night was real. It was as real as the storm that nearly killed me, as real as the cold that still clings to my bones. The house is still there, waiting, buried beneath the weight of the snow and the years. And though I've tried to forget, I know the truth. The house isn't just haunted, it's hungry.
Next story.
I don't like winter, especially not in this place. It's as if the cold seeps into your bones, leaving you unable to shake the chill. I never thought I'd end up here, but after my mother passed away, I had no choice but to move into the old family cabin. It was isolated, buried deep in the woods, but I needed the space to grieve, and honestly, I was running from everything. Running from the life I had built in the city, from the memories, and from the emptiness that was creeping up on me. The cabin was always meant to be a retreat, a place to escape the world. But to me, it felt more like a prison, The walls were thick with age, the floors creaked with every step, and the drafty windows allowed the cold to invade. It didn't help that it was winter, and the snow had piled up around the cabin like a blanket, trapping me inside. The first night, I heard it, the sound of footsteps in the snow. Slow, deliberate steps, like someone walking just outside the window. But when I looked, there was nothing there. No footprints. Just an endless stretch of white. I figured it was the wind or maybe an animal, but the feeling of being watched gnawed at me. The next evening, as the sun set and the temperature plummeted, I heard it again. The footsteps. They were closer this time, moving around the back of the house, tapping against the wooden siding. I froze, not sure whether I should go check or hide under the blankets. My rational mind told me it was just some animal again, maybe a deer or a fox. But my gut told me something else. I went to the door, hesitated, and opened it just a crack. The cold air hit me like a slap to the face, but I couldn't see anything in the darkness. No shadow, no figure, only the sound of the wind howling through the trees. I stood there for a moment, heart pounding, and then I heard it. A whisper. Soft at first, like a breath on the wind, but then it became clear enough to make out words. Come outside. I didn't move. I wasn't sure whether I was hearing things or if someone was really out there. My breath caught in my throat as I shut the door, bolted it, and backed away. But the whisper didn't stop. It continued, growing louder with each passing second. Come outside. I'm waiting. I stumbled back, my head spinning. The voice sounded so familiar, but I couldn't place it. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I looked out the window, the glass fogged with condensation from the heat inside, and that's when I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the woods. It was just a silhouette, but the way it moved, it was wrong. Jerky. Unnatural. It stood there, staring at the cabin for what felt like an eternity, and then, in the blink of an eye, it was gone. I slammed the curtains shut, my hands trembling. I couldn't breathe. Was I losing my mind? I knew this cabin had a history. Every family in the area knew the stories. The old legends about spirits that roamed the forest, whispers of things that had happened before I was born. But I had never believed in any of it. Not really. That night, sleep wouldn't come. The wind howled, and every creak of the house felt like footsteps following me from room to room. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see that figure standing in the woods, waiting for me. The next morning, I decided to get out. I bundled up and left the cabin, desperate to find some sense of normalcy. I walked through the woods, trying to ignore the strange sensation that I was being followed. The snow crunched under my boots, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was just out of sight, moving with me. After a couple of hours, I found a small clearing near a stream. It was peaceful, serene, and I couldn't help but relax, even though I knew I should head back. I stood there for a while trying to calm myself, but then the air grew cold again. It wasn't just the temperature, it was something else. A presence, an unnatural cold that made my skin prickle. I turned around and saw it again. The figure, standing at the edge of the trees just outside the clearing. It was closer this time, and I could see it more clearly. A tall, thin figure dressed in tattered clothes. Its face was hidden beneath a hood, but I could feel its eyes on me, burning through the darkness. Come with me, the voice whispered again, but this time it wasn't just a whisper. It was clear, like it was right next to me, in my ear. I took a step back, my legs shaking. It wasn't a voice, it wasn't even human. It was something else, something ancient and malevolent, reaching out to pull me in. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest, my legs moving faster than they ever had before. The snow beneath me seemed to get deeper, as if the earth itself was trying to swallow me whole. I could hear the footsteps behind me, the sound growing louder with every passing second. It was chasing me. I stumbled, falling to the ground, and when I looked up, I saw the figure standing directly in front of me, its hollow eyes gleaming in the moonlight. It was so close that I could feel its icy breath on my skin. And then it spoke, its voice now a low, guttural growl. You should never have come here. I froze, paralyzed with fear. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The coldness enveloped me, filling my lungs, making it impossible to breathe. But then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished into the woods. The cold lifted, and the wind began to die down. I was left alone, lying in the snow, gasping for air. I don't know how long I stayed there, shaking before I managed to get to my feet. I ran back to the cabin, locking every door and window behind me. I didn't dare leave again, not even to gather my things. I knew it wasn't safe. I had come to this place seeking solitude, but instead, I had found something far worse. A presence that didn't belong in this world. That was days ago. The storm rages outside, and the nights seem to stretch on forever. I still hear the footsteps in the snow and the whispering voice that calls to me from the woods. I can feel the coldness creeping into my bones, and I know it's only a matter of time before it comes for me again. The worst part? I don't think I'm alone in this house anymore.
Next story.
The storm came in without warning. It wasn't even supposed to snow that night. The weatherman had said it would be clear, that the cold front had passed. But here I was, standing in the middle of a snowstorm in the middle of nowhere. It was my first night at the cabin I had rented for a few weeks. I needed some time away, a place to think, to clear my head after everything that had happened. The city was suffocating, and my apartment felt more like a tomb than a home. The cabin was the perfect retreat. Remote, secluded, just the kind of quiet I needed to escape my thoughts. But the storm, I wasn't expecting that. The wind howled through the trees, the snow swirling in thick, angry sheets. The cabin, old and weathered, groaned under the pressure. I double-checked the windows, making sure they were shut tight, the cold from outside making the room feel even emptier. I lit a fire in the hearth, the crackling flames offering little comfort against the relentless fury of the storm. I sat there, staring into the fire, the darkness of the cabin pressing in around me. That's when I heard the sound. It was faint at first, so faint I thought it was just the wind. But it grew louder, a soft scratching like nails on wood. I turned my head, looking toward the door. The scratching stopped, and everything went still. The fire crackled, the wind howled, but there was something else. Something that didn't belong. I stood up, my heart racing. I moved toward the door, the scratching sound now replaced by a low thumping, like something or someone was hitting the door from the other side. I didn't open it. I couldn't. There was no one out there. Who would be out in the storm? But the thumping continued, persistent, rhythmic. I backed away slowly, my breath coming out in sharp bursts. The room felt colder now, even with the fire blazing in the hearth. I tried to ignore it, tried to tell myself it was just the storm, the wind playing tricks on me. But as the thumping continued, a thought crept into my mind. What if there was someone out there? What if someone needed help? Against my better judgment, I opened the door. The storm hit me like a slap in the face. The snow whipped around me, blinding me for a moment. But I didn't see anyone. The porch was empty, covered in thick snow. Nothing stirred in the darkness. I stepped outside, heart pounding, eyes scanning the shadowy outline of the trees. There was no one, no sign of life, just the wind howling through the branches. I stood there for a long moment, the cold biting into my skin, before I stepped back inside, closing the door behind me. But as I turned, I froze. The thumping wasn't coming from the door anymore. It was coming from the other side of the room. I couldn't believe it. I was alone in the cabin. I had checked. There was no one else. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. But the thumping persisted, louder now as if it were getting closer. I walked slowly toward the sound, my legs heavy with fear. The noise was coming from the corner, near the window. It sounded almost like someone was tapping on the glass. I couldn't breathe. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. Slowly, carefully, I turned my head, eyes scanning the window. And then I saw it. A face. A pale face, pressed against the glass from the outside. Eyes wide and empty, mouth open in a silent scream. The face was twisted in a way that shouldn't have been possible, as if the person's neck had been bent backward at an unnatural angle. I screamed, stumbling backward, my heart racing. I backed away from the window, but the face didn't move. It stayed there, staring in at me, its eyes unblinking, unyielding. Then the thumping came again, this time coming from directly behind me. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat, but there was nothing there. Nothing at all. I backed away slowly, my mind racing, searching for any logical explanation. I was alone. There was no one else here. I had to be imagining things. But then the face at the window began to move. It wasn't just a face anymore. It was a figure, its body slowly dragging itself toward the glass, as if it were scraping its way through the snow toward me. It reached the door, and then, with a slow, deliberate motion, it began to scratch at the wood, nails dragging down the surface, leaving deep gouges in the door. I turned and ran. I didn't stop until I was locked in the bedroom, the door bolted shut. I collapsed onto the bed, gasping for air, my mind reeling from what I had just seen. The sound of scratching was louder now, closer, as if whatever was out there was trying to get in. I didn't dare move. I sat there in the dark, listening to the sound of its movements outside the door. The wind howled, the storm continued its furious assault, but I could hear it over everything. The scraping, the scratching, the desperate tapping of nails on wood. It went on for hours. When the sun finally rose the next morning, the storm had passed. The sky was clear, the snow still falling gently, but the world felt eerily quiet. I stayed in the bedroom, too afraid to leave, too afraid to see what was waiting for me outside. But when I finally gathered the courage to open the door, there was nothing. No footprints in the snow, no signs of any struggle. It was as if the night had never happened. But I knew it had. I knew what I had seen. The face at the window, the scratching, the thumping, and the figure that had been outside, its eyes burning into mine. I packed up and left the cabin that morning. I didn't care that I had paid for the full week. I couldn't stay there any longer. But as I drove away, something lingered in the back of my mind. The feeling that I wasn't alone, that whatever had been out there, whatever I had seen, was still watching me. And I wasn't sure if it was ever going to stop.
Next story.
It was Christmas Eve, and I had never felt more alone. The lights of the small town twinkled from a distance, but the cabin I was renting for the holiday was far enough off the beaten path that I couldn't see them. It wasn't like I had anywhere to go anyway. I had come to the cabin to get away from the constant reminders of the holidays, memories of happier times that I couldn't escape. I needed a break from everything, from people, from the overwhelming noise of the world. The cabin was cozy, nestled deep in the forest, surrounded by towering pines. The air was crisp, the snow thick and untouched outside. It was perfect for solitude. The fire crackled in the hearth, and I settled into my chair with a book, the glow of the Christmas tree lights casting a soft, warm hue over the room. I felt a small comfort in the flickering shadows, but it didn't last. There was something strange about the cabin. I had rented it online, never having seen it in person, and when I first arrived, it was just as it had been described. A quaint little log cabin with a view of the woods and a fireplace. But now, after a few days of being there, I began to notice things. Small things that didn't quite add up. The way the floorboards creaked even when no one was walking on them. The strange, almost imperceptible draft that would occasionally brush past my skin, no matter how tightly I sealed the windows. The quiet hum of the house like it was alive in some way. But the strangest thing of all was the sound. The whispering. It began the second night I stayed there. At first, I thought it was just the wind, the kind of wind that sings through the trees, whistling and rattling the windows. But it didn't sound like the wind. It was too deliberate, too rhythmic. It sounded like someone was trying to say something, but the words were lost, muffled, as if they were coming from far away. I didn't think much of it. Old houses creaked. The wind had a way of making eerie sounds. But it was harder to ignore as the days passed. It was always at night. Low, gentle whispers just on the edge of hearing. Sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night, my heart racing, and I'd listen, straining to hear the whispers more clearly. But no matter how hard I tried, the words never formed. And then, on Christmas Eve, it happened. I was sitting by the fire, sipping my tea, trying to lose myself in the warmth of the cabin, when I heard it again. The whispering, but this time it was louder, and it was coming from the corner of the room. I froze. The fire crackled loudly and my breath quickened. I strained my ears, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. There was no one else in the cabin. I had checked every room earlier, and the door was locked. I was alone. The whispering grew louder, more distinct. I could almost make out words now. My name. Lucy. Lucy. I stood up, heart pounding. The voice was unmistakable. It wasn't coming from the fireplace. It wasn't the wind. It was in the room with me. Lucy. I turned toward the source of the voice, and that's when I saw it. The shadow. It was small at first, just a flicker at the edge of my vision. But as I blinked, it grew. A tall, dark figure, standing in the corner of the room where the walls met the ceiling. Its features were obscured, as if the shadow was made of nothing but darkness. It was still for a moment, and then it moved. The figure seemed to slide across the room impossibly fast, like it was gliding, its form shifting and stretching as it approached. I couldn't breathe. My chest was tight, my heart thudding painfully in my ears. The whispering continued, growing louder, more urgent, and now the voice wasn't just calling my name, it was repeating something else, something I couldn't quite understand. I backed away, my hands trembling, my legs nearly giving out beneath me. The shadow moved again, closer this time, until it was right in front of me. I could feel the cold emanating from it, freezing the air around me. The whispers stopped suddenly, and in the silence, the figure spoke. Leave. The word was simple, but its weight pressed down on me, crushing my chest. I couldn't move. My feet were frozen to the floor, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. Leave, or it will take you. The voice was low and guttural, almost like it came from the depths of the earth. I felt a cold shiver run through me, and for a split second I could swear I saw a flash of something. A face, twisted in agony, its eyes wide open in terror. But the figure was gone before I could focus on it. The whispering returned, but this time it was a low, mocking laughter, echoing through the cabin. The lights of the tree flickered violently, casting erratic shadows across the walls. I stumbled back, my breath quickening, my mind spinning. I ran to the door, yanking it open, and bolted into the snow. The cold bit into my skin, but I didn't care. I didn't look back. My feet pounded through the snow, the wind howling in my ears until I reached the main road. But even then, I didn't stop. I couldn't. I spent the night in my car, my hands shaking on the steering wheel, just too terrified to drive back into that cabin. I couldn't explain what happened, what I had seen or heard or felt. I didn't even know if it was real, but one thing was certain. I wasn't going back. The next morning, I left the cabin behind. I don't know who or what was there or why it had chosen me, but I know I'll never forget the whispers, and I'll never go near that place again. They say cabins in the woods can be beautiful, peaceful getaways. But for me, it will always be a place of darkness where something waits for those who stay too long.